Well, good afternoon and welcome to the kickoff of the 44th annual and our first ever virtual Francis Wilson Thompson Critical Issues Forum with our special guest, David Sheff. I am BJ Hull, the still relatively new Vice Chancellor for Advancement for the University of Michigan-Flint. I joined the university near the end of January of this year. I'd like to take a moment to thank all of you for choosing to spend your time with us this afternoon. As we all know, it has been a trying and challenging year, and it just means the world to us that so many of you have stuck with us and worked through the hurdles to transition this program into a new format. So thank you. I would also like to thank the entire team that has worked so hard to make this event happen today, and specifically Mary Jo Sikelski and Sheila Courier, who without their efforts, we would not be here today. So going back to my old days of leading camps for kids, a round of applause for all of you that have helped make this happen. Finally, I'd like to take a moment to remember our benefactor, Francis Wilson Thompson. Without her leadership and philanthropic support, we would not be here today. She was a true original. Interested in books and ideas, Mrs. Thompson believed that a community could and should be enriched through dialogue. It was that belief that led Mrs. Thompson to create a lecture series that would bring leading experts to Flint to debate and discuss the critical issues of our times. It has been our distinct honor to host this annual series for 44 years, and we are forever grateful to Mrs. Thompson and the Thompson family for this lasting legacy. At this time, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Cheryl Groden, Assistant Professor in our University of Michigan-Flint Department of Social Work, to introduce our keynote speaker today. Dr. Groden received her Master's of Social Work from the University of California, Berkeley, and her PhD in Social Work from Michigan State University. She joined our university in the fall of 2017 after teaching at the MSU School of Social Work and coordinated MSU's Levade program in gerontology. Dr. Groden's practice background includes work with older Holocaust survivors and their families, community-based geriatric social work, and as a medical social worker. Her articles have been published in the American Journal of Geriatric Psychiatry and The Field Educator. Dr. Groden, welcome to our program.
Thank you very much, BJ. It is my honor and pleasure to introduce David Sheff as our keynote speaker at the University of Michigan-Flint Critical Issues Forum. David Sheff is an award-winning journalist and the author of numerous books on addiction, most notably Beautiful Boy, A Father's Journey Through His Son's Addiction. The book was based on his article, My Addicted Son, which appeared in the New York Times Magazine and won a special award from the American Psychological Association for its outstanding contribution to the understanding of addiction. Beautiful Boy was adapted into a 2018 feature film starring Steve Carell and Timothy Chalamet. David has continued to leave an incredible mark on our societal understanding of addiction. Beautiful Boy was followed by the book Clean, Overcoming Addiction and Ending America's Greatest Tragedy, as well as numerous other books and initiatives. David serves on an advisory board of the Jed and Clinton Health Matters campus program, which helps colleges and universities promote emotional well-being, mental health programming, and reduce substance abuse and prevent suicide among their students. He recently launched the Beautiful Boy Fund, devoted to making quality, evidence-based treatment available and supporting research to further the field of addiction medicine. David Sheff is a journalist and a skilled storyteller, weaving together personal stories with a larger societal tale. All stories are powerful, the ones we tell and the ones that we keep inside ourselves. Often the stories which we keep inside are the ones that eat at us and our loved ones. Many of these stories are not told because of shame or stigma. For many people who experience addiction, shame and stigma keep these stories inside. David Sheff uses his voice to tell the story of his son's journey through addiction and to share his own personal story as a family member struggling to help his son. Sheff's ability to share these stories helps us to eliminate the shame and stigma of addiction. Sheff asks in Beautiful Boy, why does it help to read other stories? Part of his answer is that he felt telling his story would be worthwhile if it could help anyone the way other writers had helped him. Sheff writes, "A stranger's story seems to give others the permission to tell their story. Whether it's an addiction to meth or alcohol or opioids, stigma or shame often keeps people from sharing the pain out loud, which is essential for healing." As a clinical social worker, I've witnessed the power of stories told out loud and the ones kept inside. Many years ago, my first job, fresh out of my MSW program, was at Jewish Family and Children's Services in San Francisco, working with Holocaust survivors and their families. As these elderly survivors navigated the too often physical and mental health challenges and losses that accompany old age, the stories from their past, long kept inside, resurfaced. For many years, survivors were told to not talk about the past, to move on with their lives. But trauma does not sit back quietly, nor should it. Providing survivors the permission to tell their stories through oral histories and intergenerational support groups and social support groups was essential for healing. Wounds were slow to heal, but it was important for these stories to be told. We see that now with the Me Too movement. Trauma does not sit back quietly. In my work with survivors and their family members, and with my other clients who experience mental health problems, chronic pain, and addiction, I've seen how finding solidarity in shared stories reasserts a sense of agency over traumatic experiences as proud survivors rather than those suffering in secret. David Sheff's advocacy has made a huge difference in the prevention and treatment of addiction. We see here in the state of Michigan an ongoing need for substance abuse counselors and addiction specialists who are trained in evidence-based practice. The School of Education and Human Services at UM-Flint has worked to meet this need by offering Michigan's only online Bachelor of Science in Substance Abuse Treatment and Intervention, as well as a substance abuse treatment minor designed to complement the curriculum of social work, education, criminal justice, psychology, nursing, and other majors. In my teaching at UM-Flint, I've also created and offer a freshman seminar on the opioid crisis, helping students to better understand from a local, national, and global perspective, and for students to consider how they, as change agents, can make a difference. There's a lot of work yet to be done, but rewriting the narrative around addiction and overcoming stigma is the first step. I'm so pleased to introduce our speaker, David Sheff, whose powerful storytelling has inspired all of us. Before David begins, I just want to let everybody know that if you have questions that you think of throughout his talk, to please add them in the Q&A section at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And now on to David.
Professor Groden, that was, I don't have to say anything. You sort of summed it all up right there. And that was, you know, what a powerful message. And it also is heartening to hear that the conversation is taking place on the university campus and also, I guess now virtually, in ways that frankly, it's not happening other places. So thank you. Thanks, Vice Chancellor Hull. It's an honor to be here. I wish I could be with you in person. I was really looking forward to that. I love, I've been to your campus before. My niece graduated from Michigan, and I guess this is sort of, you know, this is where we're living right now. And it actually relates to what we're talking about now, the whole way that our lives have changed this year because of you know, this pandemic that we're living in. We know from all the research that there are, you know, we talk a lot about drugs and we talk about addiction, but oftentimes we don't talk about what causes them and the roots of those conditions. And what we know is that there are a number of factors that increase the likelihood that someone will become addicted and someone will have substance use problems. And we are living in the middle of some of those circumstances that increase the stress on people that leads to drug use. And indeed, that's one of the things that we know is that, you know, we have this idea. There was this great survey that says a lot about the assumptions that we have about drug use. And there was a survey, and this went, you know, to people younger than university students. This was in high school students, but this is where it begins. A survey of thousands of kids, I think it was 7,000 kids, teenagers around the United States, that asked the question, why do you use drugs, or why do you think your friends use drugs? If you don't, what's the motivation? And they asked parents, the same number of parents. So there were 5,000 or 7,000 parents that were asked, why do you think teenagers are using drugs? And the answer that parents gave was one that I think I would have assumed was the right answer, because it's fun, because kids like to get high and party, and then also because of peer pressure. Those are two things that do have an impact, but I would have assumed that that was the main motivator. But that's not what these teenage kids said. They said that the one reason that they used drugs was because of stress. That when they drill down, it was stresses related to school, whether it was related to their homes. Kids are living in stressful environments and homes and stressful neighborhoods. But whatever it is, that's a trigger for drug use, and it makes sense. What did drugs do? I mean, there is this, at least for the initial period when someone uses drugs, there is this moment of euphoria. It makes us feel better. People say when they come home from work, it's a sort of a classic thing. You see it on TV shows all the time. People get in, they walk in the door and say, I need a drink. Well, why? Because there is an impact of drugs that helps people relax and helps calm down. And that's because it shifts the way that we think. What we don't understand, or what most people don't understand, is that the reasons it does that is very complicated. It impacts the brain in different ways depending on the drug and the combination of drugs. And also, the other thing that people don't understand is that some people are much more susceptible in their brains to that initial drug use, that use that we would consider casual use, to becoming problematic and ultimately becoming addiction. So what COVID has done is it's turned up the intensity of a lot of the risk groups that cause stresses in our lives that make it more likely that we're going to use drugs. And some of those are obvious. People are more isolated. People who are isolated, many people who are isolated, it is, their way of coping with the world is to be connected with people and is to be social. And at a time when so many university students aren't on campus and are in their, in their rooms, and they're, and sitting on their desks or in their bed, and aren't connected to people. Maybe for some people that's actually a preference, and it alleviates stress, because there are some advantages that some of the research tells us that for some people, it's freeing not to be in a classroom situation, for example, where they're, for somebody who is sort of less comfortable in a social situation like that this might be empowering. But there's a lot of people that really miss that connection. And it's not just in an academic setting, but of course it is in a social setting. So it's not a surprise that the use of drugs is way up, and the number of overdoses is way up. And it doesn't just apply to drugs, it also applies to suicide. The number of the suicide rates have skyrocketed during COVID. It's also important to understand that some of it is related to not just isolation, but also just the uncertainty that is causing a lot of stress in people's lives. What's going to happen next? Well, we don't know. Every single day, it feels like we're living in a new reality. And when we try to plan on the future like we normally did or would have done, we can't, because we don't know what's coming. And so that is really stressful. And it's particularly stressful, I think, on young people. So there is and the fear of becoming ill. And what are the implications of the fear of people we love and becoming ill? How scary is that? And then there's one more reason that it's more of a practical reason that drug use is more dangerous now. In the past, it was most likely that people who are using drugs, especially the opioids like heroin or fentanyl or OxyContin or those drugs, and some of the other sort of the stimulants like crystal methamphetamine or cocaine, we're using it in a social circumstance. We're using it in an environment where they were not alone, which meant that if there was a problem and if somebody began to overdose, there was somebody to call 911 or to administer Narcan if it was available and to save their life. A lot of people now are using by themselves. They're completely alone. And so if there is an overdose, there isn't anybody who's watching, who knows that there's a problem and who then calls 911 and gets help, or helps themselves by administering CPR, or if it's an opioid problem, Narcan, which is a chemical which is a medication that will reverse an opioid overdose. So there's a lot of reasons that the problem is worse now, and it's measured in many, many different. Or as I said, the easiest one to track are the number of people who are dying. And there's one more factor. We live in a culture that has denied the problem of related to drugs. I mean, we sort of accept it as as something that's okay, and partying, and yeah, some people are going to become addicted, and somehow we feel like the people who become addicted, it's because they don't have willpower. They're making this choice. All they care about is getting high. They don't care about hurting other people. They don't care about their families. Well, we know that that isn't true. We know that the factors are so much more complicated. And part of the reason that if we don't talk about a problem, we don't address the problem. So if somebody is struggling with drugs because they may fear being judged and shamed and, viewed as if, they are weak and they're just making these bad decisions and bad choices, it's far less likely that they're going to talk about that, admit it, talk to their friends about it or their family, or they're going to go ask for help. And so the other factor that is really concerning that has to do with the COVID crisis is that people are not going to be treated. They're not going out for treatment. And the other thing is, of course, we're focusing as a nation on COVID because, we have to. It's a serious, terrible problem. And, and people are dying and infection rates are up in many places. I mean, it is serious. But so much as attention is taken away, therefore, from other problems, and one of them are related to mental health and mental illness, so that it's harder to get treatment now. There's less money for treatment programs. Treatment money that would have gone to treatment programs are going to COVID-related programs. So there are fewer options. I've been talking to people in programs who run programs all around the country, and many of them are closing because they just don't have the funding. And so, all these reasons, all these things, it's a problem that has been escalating and has been devastating, individuals and families and communities, is worse now. And so the idea that this conversation is taking place now, I mean, it is so important that we don't forget, and we acknowledge the fact that this is a especially tough time for people, and therefore we have to figure out what to do to compensate, to mitigate some of the extra problems that we're here experiencing now. And it's, a lot of different ways to find that people can get together and people can connect and people aren't so isolated. Professor Groden said something that, or the theme of what she spoke about is critical. Because of the history of shame and blame and again, the assumption that people who use drugs, especially who use drugs to an excess, are somehow immoral, or somehow how they are. It's a defect in some ways. They're not good people. They're bad people. That's the way we view them. And so, we don't talk about it. And because when we don't talk about something, as she was saying, we are isolated again. We don't understand that we aren't alone, and the suffering increases, and we are less likely to get help. In relation to what she was talking about this idea of sharing our stories and the importance of sharing our stories. When we don't share our stories, when we're hiding, when we're pretending that this isn't happening, we end up feeling that we are alone, and that we are the only ones suffering. There's a friend of ours who lives out near where I live in California, the writer Annie Lamott, and some of you may have read her work. She says that we increase our suffering because we compare our insides with other people's outsides. And it is a really profound idea, and it's a reality for so much of us. I mean, when we are hiding what's going on, we don't know that other people are suffering, that our neighbors, other people in our communities, other people, you know, if we are in whether it's the virtual or other classroom, you know, the people who we're talking to every single day are also suffering. And it doesn't have to be about addiction. It can be about problems in their families. It can be about grief and loss. It can be about, you know, fears about the future. Some people are suffering depression, and some people are suffering, you know, heightened anxiety problems, anxiety disorders. And suddenly when you do start to talk about it, and I learned this over the course of my experience when I decided to write about what was happening in our family, I learned we are not alone. Everyone is suffering. You know, we'll go back in time to the time that shifted everything in my life because of my son, my eldest son, became addicted when he was a teenager. And in relation to his drug use, it was horrific. I mean, he was doing things that were unconscionable, and that it just baffled me as his father. He was, you know, stealing. He stole money and credit cards. He broke into our house and our friends' homes. He stole even from his little brother. I mean, and that was so baffling to me because I knew he adored his little brother, and the idea that he would steal from him was completely, it was completely baffling. And I was in the dark, and part of the reason I was in the dark is because I didn't know. I mean, my only image of what drug addiction looked like are images I got from movies of, you know, or from the celebrity deaths, you know, John Belushi or Philip Seymour Hoffman or other people who died, or, you know, from drugs or drank themselves to death. And so I was in hell, but also hiding it. So I remember I was at a swim meet, and this is one moment, and part of my son's drug use was meant that he would disappear, and I wouldn't know if he was alive or dead. And I was terrified that the next phone call would be from, you know, an emergency room or police that told me that my son had overdosed and died, or that he had ended up in prison or arrested because he had done something on drugs again that he would never have done otherwise. So I didn't know where he was. And, you know, for parents who have been there, who have been in that terrible situation where we don't know where a child is and we don't know if they're alive or dead. I was suffering. My wife, you know, Karen, and I were both suffering together. We weren't sleeping. It was a nightmarish time. But we also tried to do our best to be the best parents we could to our other kids. You know, I have two younger children, Daisy and Jasper. And we were at a swim meet of Jasper's, and Karen and I were on the sidelines with a lot of other parents, and cheering on, you know, the kids as they were swimming. You know, go team, go Sharks. And I was dying inside. I was pretending on the outside because I never would have admitted what was going on at that time. I didn't know where my son was. I was petrified. I wasn't sleeping. I wasn't eating. I just was completely obsessed with the potential loss of my son. And yet I'm sitting on the sidelines of the swim meet, you know, cheering on, and with all these other parents, terrified that somebody would know what was going on. I didn't want, you know, them to judge my son. I didn't want them to judge me, because we have this idea that if we have somebody in our family with mental illness, including addiction, then we must be, you know, terrible parents. And so I was hiding this. And then, you know, I spent 10 years of this hell. My son was addicted. There were many times that he almost did die. Many times he was gone. But he was doing better. And because I am a journalist, I've always written about things that I care about. I decided that here was this problem that we weren't addressing in our culture, and we needed to address. And so I decided to go forward and to write about what we were experiencing, and was terrified because of the, you know, exposing our family to that kind of judgment and scrutiny was scary, but also with this idea that it was, you know, it was important that we talk about this, and we stopped pretending that it wasn't happening, because I knew too well that, you know, it was, and the devastation that came with it if it did happen. And so I wrote about it. It came out in a story in the New York Times Magazine. It led to the book Beautiful Boy. And when the story was out there, it is no exaggeration to tell you that I would say about 10 or 12 of the 15, you know, parents that were sitting on the sidelines of that swim meet came up to me at different times over the course of this and told me, you know, pulled me aside, and as if, you know, they were telling me some deep, dark secret, we've experienced what you've experienced in your family. Sometimes, again, it wasn't about drug use. I remember some dad who I thought was, he was like this macho, successful, always in a suit and tie, even on the sides of the swim team meets, parent breaking down and starting to cry and telling me that he had a daughter who had an eating disorder, and they had told everybody at the school that she was leaving because of some academic option that she had for that semester, but in fact that she was in treatment for her eating disorder. And I was just struck that here was this man suffering in pain. He was having the hardest time to admit that his daughter had a mental psychological problem, something that was so common. And he had also been one of those parents suffering at the side of the swim meet, and I was looking at him, feeling that I couldn't admit what I was going through. And so I learned, over the period of time when I finally did decide to write about our experience, that we aren't alone, that everyone is suffering. And that is not a solution. That recognition that we are not alone and sharing our solutions, our stories, is not an ultimate solution. Doesn't cure addiction. It doesn't cure eating disorders. It doesn't cure depression or anxiety, but it is a start. And it's a start, first of all, because it's enormous relief to know that we aren't alone. It's an enormous relief to realize that it's not about, that we are bad, that we're a bad family, that there's something wrong with us. It's that there is something going on in our culture and we are part of it. And so there's enormous relief, and we can move from this self-blame and this guilt to a different kind of feeling, sort of a feeling of compassion for the people who are struggling, a feeling of compassion for the families, and we can figure out ways to get help. So it's an enormous relief, and it is the beginning of a shift in it leads to treatment, because when we're open, we can have conversations. We understand we aren't alone. We understand someone else is going through this. We can get advice. We can share, we can process what we're going through. So it's essential. And there's another piece about the sharing of stories that is incredibly powerful and incredibly important. And it is that when I was going through this for 10 years, this was this swirl of chaos and pain inside my brain. I was completely overwhelmed for that whole time, terrified, overwhelmed, confused, baffled. And part of the process when I finally decided to write about it was that the writing process is cathartic in some ways. It is almost, I had this vision of the way it was, if you can imagine this chaos and the swirling confusion inside my brain. But to get it from there to the page involved sorting through it and sort of teasing it apart. And in an attempt to understand what was going on, I did learn to understand it better, and I did feel better. I was able to function better. Again, it wasn't the solution, but it was a huge, huge step forward. The other thing that happened for me personally is that when I decided to write about what was going on, finally, my son was doing better, and so I felt some freedom to move forward. I did feel that there was this urgency to talk about a problem that people weren't talking about that was impacting so many kids, so many adults, so many of our families, that I wrote about it. And then when Beautiful Boy came out, it was a revelation. It was a transformative for me, because not only did I realize that that I wasn't alone, that people who are suffering like this weren't alone, but I realized that just the pervasiveness, the ubiquity of this problem, because I heard from, first it was hundreds of people, then it was thousands of people, and since then it's been tens of thousands of people. I have no idea how many over the course of the last 10 years since Beautiful Boy came out. And so I realized not only that I wasn't alone, but I was realizing that we were in the middle of a crisis. We were in the middle of an epidemic that was not being talked about. And I learned about it because I heard from other people who wrote to share their stories, or when I began going out and talking to places like universities and schools and communities and libraries and conventions of physicians and nurses, that this is not an isolated problem. It is a huge problem, and it's costing us, I learned, in our country, it's costing $5 billion a year we are spending on this in lost productivity and criminal justice costs and healthcare related costs. And we are losing Now, last year we lost 200 people every single day from drug overdose. And this year, because of, as I said before, the escalated use, because of the pandemic, we're losing way more than 200 people a day. We don't know the exact number. I realized that this is a problem that wasn't just devastating families, it was having an impact on our country, on every single community that was suffering, not just overdose deaths, but spikes in crime related to drug use, spikes in, the implications about that, the taxing the criminal justice system. In some communities, if you go to an emergency room, maybe some of that's, maybe this percentages are less because people are coming in because of COVID. I don't know, but in some emergency rooms, 80 to 90% of the people that walk in the door are there because of something related to drugs, either an overdose or else an accident related to drugs, a shooting, car accident, whatever it is. So think about, we talk about the crisis of healthcare and the overtaxing of our healthcare system. If we were to address this problem and to lower that number of people who come into the emergency rooms, that think about the amount of money we're spending, the amount of time we're focusing, doctors are focusing, nurses are focusing, people in emergencies are focusing on these crises related to drug use. So I realized that this is a problem that we don't talk about, that we haven't talked about, and therefore we haven't been addressing. And it is affecting what we now know are at least 22 million people in America are suffering from active addiction. That means that they're using right now and they're in trouble and that they need help and they need resources and support that we don't have. But if you think about every one of those 20 million people who are suffering, then you think about their families. And so it is not only that the people who are actively using drugs that are impacted, but their families. And in every family, there are at least, again, statistics show us 3 other people that are impacted. And then you extend it from there, people, friends, beyond the immediate families. And so we're talking about at least 100 million people who are impacted by addiction at this moment. And again, we aren't addressing it. Because of the opioid crisis, which elevated this to a new level. And it's not just because the numbers were higher, but it was because of the kinds of people, families that were being affected. I mean, there also is an incredibly, there's a racial and economic factor here, which is that in the past, as long as drug use and overdose deaths have been focused on communities that we don't talk about or think about or ignore as much as we can, it was even more hidden. It was easier. There was an epidemic before the opioid epidemic that took place that was related to cocaine and crack cocaine. And because it was localized mostly in urban communities and ghettos and places without resources, who were considered in some ways, weren't considered. We didn't talk about it in the same way, but suddenly with the opioid problem, because it started not from people going out and shooting heroin, but started from people using prescription medications, Oxycontin, oxycodone, Vicodin, it was impacting a different class of people. And this was more of a middle class and upper class group of people who did have more access to a megaphone, and there was different kinds of concern. And so in the past, when it was ignored, suddenly there were organizations of parents and others in towns and cities around the country that had banded together to try to figure out what was going on and what could be done about it, because the numbers of these 200 people every single day related to opioid overdose had increased. And it was, it's appalling that, and it was another factor that was a sign of the racism that we're experiencing now. I just heard on the radio today that 3 times more Black Americans are dying of COVID-related illness than white, and it was the same of drug use in that at that period of time. But whatever it took to have this conversation, I mean, it's tragic, it's appalling, that is what it took. But whatever it took, it's good that we are facing it in a new way. But again, the resources are not there. The money that is going to treatment, if you consider the numbers of people who need treatment, it is, it's just a drop in the bucket. One of the sad parts of that, besides this hidden suffering that is going on and devastating families and communities and people, is that we are not connecting with what science has told us about drug use. We did not, because it was sort of looked at as this, moral issue that people who use drugs were, again, they were, there was something deficient about them morally. We didn't understand what we know now about drug addiction. Drug addiction is not a choice. Nobody wants to become addicted. Drug addiction is an illness, a brain disease. It's a mental illness that has to do with the wiring inside our brains. And once we recognized that, and drug addiction was acknowledged to be that, and the American Psychological Association and the American Medical Association all acknowledged that, insurance began to cover addiction-related treatments. It still doesn't cover enough, but still it does cover some. It's required to because of the Parity Act with the ACA. That there followed from that, there's been this cycle, a recognition that addiction is not a choice, but it is a disease, and therefore we have to treat it as a disease. And so some more money has come into it. I love the fact that Michigan has, and it sounds like programs that you have to educate about addiction and addiction medicine. It's extraordinary, and it is still very rare, but it's extraordinary because it is moving addiction medicine into where it should be, which is a social problem and a health problem, not a problem of morals and ethics, a health problem. And what we have discovered is, now that we have treated addiction as a health problem, is that we can treat people who become addicted. And that is a revelation. It's a revelation because of the impact on individuals. People realize, oh, if I'm sick and if I can get help, I will, it's not this moral. I am not a bad person, and I can get help. It's easy. It's hard to get help. It's hard to get help. It's hard to access treatment for people who need it. But we understand that when we understand that this is a medical condition that can be treated, that we have research that shows that there are a whole list of evidence-based treatments that help people get well, then we go on a completely new path. We have to, if we're going to acknowledge this, and if we're going to move forward, we have to acknowledge that we have a system in place that is archaic. The message that we give around addiction and substance use disorders is archaic, and it is appalling. When we view this as a problem of choice, and morals, we came out of a system, we created a system around it that also created this draconian, I consider it evil way of facing people who are addicted. We categorize them, we shun them, we judge them, and we put them in a system that was all about having to recognize, yes, I have these moral deficiencies, and I have to confess that I have these problems, and in order to be treated, I had to go through this moral inventory. And I'm not saying those things are bad, but that is not the way that we deal with a medical problem. That we had this really archaic idea that the only way someone could get treated for addiction is if they made this conscious choice that their lives were falling apart to the point that they were desperate to get help. And the only way that they would get there is if they hit bottom. This idea of hitting bottom, it still predominates in many, many, many communities, and in many even addiction treatment centers, that people can't get well until they hit bottom. It is appalling. We know that addiction is a disease. What do we know about disease? We know that we don't want a disease to get worse, because if it gets worse, it's harder to treat. There's more physical impact. With addiction, there's more of a brain, the more impact on the brain, on the neurological system. We don't want it to get worse. And the other thing that comes with addiction and some mental illnesses that don't come with other physical illnesses is that because it's a brain disease, it is related to an impairment of judgment. And so, my son did things that he would never do if he was in his right mind. I used to think, God, Nick has gone crazy. And the truth is that he was crazy because he was not able to operate with a brain that was functioning properly. The reason that we do things that we do that are considered smart and moral It's not an instinct we're born with. It is something that we learn. But if our brains aren't functioning properly, then we are not functioning properly. So the connection of all those things, the recognition that this is a brain disease, means that we don't want it to get worse until there are potentially devastating, including lethal consequences. People end up in jail, people end up in prison, their families explode, they end up isolated, they end up on the streets and homeless, and they die. So we want to treat this as soon as we can. And when we understand that it is a medical problem, it's obvious. So we don't want people to hit bottom. I hear all the time from people who tell me, mostly parents, but sometimes husbands, wives, partners, whatever it is, that they heard this message over and over again, that somebody who is addicted must hit bottom before they can be helped. Therefore, they stood back, they didn't intervene, and these horrible consequences came true. A dad wrote me and said, I kept hearing that I had to let him hit bottom. I became so frustrated trying to help him, nothing seemed to work. So I did, I stood back, and he asked for help. And I said, I'm sorry, you have to figure this out yourself. I got a phone call in the middle of the night from the police who told me that they had my son and he'd overdosed and died. Did he hit his bottom now? Was my love tough enough? They talk about tough love, and related to this, you can't respond with love because you have to practice tough love and not help, because ultimately if you do, you will be doing a disservice. You'll be enabling a person. We are slowly getting rid of those archaic ideas, but it is really slow. So one of the things I learned is that we don't want people to hit bottom. We don't want to judge them. We want to get them help as quickly as we can, and we want to welcome them, in a sense, to the community of the treatment community, just like we would do if somebody had another medical problem. If somebody had cancer, or we thought they might have a kind of cancer, we would instantly bring them to a doctor. We would get a diagnosis. We would, they would take tests. If it turned out that they needed to go to a specialist, they would go to a specialist. At that point, if there was a crisis, there would be crisis intervention, chemotherapy, radiation, whatever it was. Otherwise, there'd be monitoring. We need to do the exact same things when someone is experiencing addiction or other mental health problems. And we don't. Again, we're starting to, and it sounds like the University of Michigan, it sounds like you're doing things that need to be done. And it's not just about educating people, but it is offering services through health departments or health systems within schools, counseling, referral to treatment for people who need it. The crisis continues. The recognition of what doesn't work, it's starting, it's increasing, as I say. So then the question is, what works? And there's not a lot of time. I'll address it quickly, and maybe in the question and answer period when we get there, we'll talk about it more. But when I talk about how we can actually treat addiction, if it's treatable, and I'm saying that it is, how do we do that? We go back to something I said before, which is the research that tells us that people who use drugs are not using drugs just because they want to get high. That there are all this myriad of factors that encourage drug use, that complicate drug use, and that complicate addiction and increase the chances that somebody is going to get addicted. And a lot of them relate to stress. Stress is an easy word, but if you look deeper and start to ask what is causing people stress, it's really, really complicated. I mentioned some before: isolation, extra isolation now because of COVID, family problems, problems that may not seem that they should relate to mental illness, but do, the stresses that people feel because they're concerned about money, they're concerned about their careers, they feel their relationships, their marriages, their personal relationships, with whatever kinds of relationships aren't going great. But then there's another kind of stress, which is a huge stress that, again, we don't talk about and we don't recognize. And a lot of people don't understand the connection between a whole array of psychological problems, mental illnesses, psychological disorders, depression, anxiety, learning disabilities, bipolar disorder, people who are experiencing eating disorders. I mentioned attention deficit disorder, I mentioned bipolar, but you know, a whole range of psychological problems. Those people are much more likely to use drugs, to use a lot of drugs, and to become addicted. Why? Makes sense. If you are suffering depression and if you were looking for relief and nobody has ever diagnosed you with that disease or that disorder, and you've never gotten help for it, you're suffering. And the only way that prevalent for many people in this culture that seems like it's going to help, and maybe it does help for a minute, is using drugs and getting high. So people who have psychological disorders are often trying to medicate themselves. They're trying to help themselves. Um, and it, again, it can appear to help at the beginning, but ultimately, you know, drugs are a depressant. Alcohol is a depressant. Marijuana is a depressant. So if somebody suffers depression in the first place, it's just going to make it worse. So what do we do when we understand that there is this connection between drug use and these psychological problems or social problems or problems around them? People are surrounded again by living in neighborhood. Another risk factor, people who are living in neighborhoods that are characterized by poverty or that are characterized by drug use or violence. Again, it makes sense. First of all, the drugs are there, they're prevalent, plentiful. And the other thing is that people are looking for relief, for escape. So how does this relate to treating addiction? Well, when we recognize that addiction is related to all these other problems, these both physical problems and these social problems, we know what to do. We want to intervene in the problems that are associated with addiction. So if we want to have a system in place where it is easier for people to get help. First of all, to get diagnosed with whatever there is going on, excuse me. So what if somebody might be suffering depression, whether it's a child, whether it's somebody you know in school, whether it's a friend, whether it's a parent, whether it's, whomever it could be. We assume, we know that people need to, people to get depressed sometimes, everybody does. It's part of life. People get sad. But what's the difference between sadness and a psychological disorder called depression? And there is an absolute difference. But we can't know that ourselves. We can't know it for other people. We have to go to the care of a psychiatrist or psychologist who can help us figure that out. And once we know, yes, this is a clinical depression, this is clinical anxiety, this chronic condition that, again, people are looking for relief, and so they drink, and so they use drugs. They are in a social circumstance where their anxiety is turned up, so they're more likely to use drugs and get high. Makes sense. So what do we do? Well, if we try just to get drug use wrestled into shape, stop drinking, stop using drugs, get some support for that, it can help, but that's not going to solve the problem. People with depression need treatment. People with anxiety disorder need treatment. People with bipolar disorder need treatment. People with eating disorders need treatment, whatever it is. People who are in violent home situations need help to get out of those violent situations if we're going to help with their drug use. So once we understand that, we have a whole array of interventions, and they include addressing all these problems and getting people diagnosed and getting people help. The other piece of it is that people who have used drugs over a period of time, people who've used alcohol for whatever reasons, whatever these reasons that I'm describing, it does impact the brain. It's a brain disease, as I've said. So if you scan the brains of people who have become addicted or become dependent on drugs, people with substance use disorders, they don't function the same as people who don't. Their brains are rewired. People describe it as being hijacked. And when someone's brain is hijacked by drugs and by their addiction, the wiring is different. And so they can no longer experience the kinds of pleasure from a normal stimulation that normally would give us pleasure, that would make us feel okay, make us feel better. So if we're experiencing depression, there's a bottom to that. It is not devastating to the point that it is going to lead to suicide or lead to increased drug use. We want to figure out what is going on there, but we also want to figure out the social situations and the biological situations, and we also want to figure out the impact specifically of drugs and drug use. And we have a whole bunch of treatments in place to do that. It is about rewiring that brain, and it is a whole bunch of doing that. It takes time, but it's doing it with behavioral interventions, different kinds of psychological interventions, and psychiatric medications. All of those things either used separately or used together, most often used together, being administered by somebody who knows what they're doing, a doctor, a psychiatrist, a psychologist, someone trained in addiction medicine, has the ability to rewire that brain. And if you combine rewiring the brain and dealing with the social circumstances or the mental illnesses or whatever else is going on, that's how we can treat people. And we do treat people every single day. It's hard. And that's where we go to a bigger problem that is becomes a big societal problem. And it goes back to the idea that we have not faced the drug problem in our culture. Again, you don't have to be sympathetic to people who use drugs. You don't have to be a nice, sort of compassionate person to want to address this problem, because it impacts, if you are concerned about safety, if you're concerned about crime, if you're concerned about the money we're spending on healthcare that we shouldn't need to be spending on healthcare, on other impacts on families. That's motivation enough to do it, to shift the system. So that if you look at the budget of all of the impacts of our society for something that is so devastating, that has such an impact, that costs us so much money and so much grief and so much problems within the workplace and so much problems in communities and so many deaths, the amount of money we spend to face this problem is trivial. And that includes prevention techniques that don't work. What we're not spending much, and what we are spending, is mostly a waste. In high school, it starts in grade school sometimes, where we have these really naive, old-fashioned, we don't use drugs, drugs are bad. It doesn't work. But we know that there are prevention techniques that do work. We need to focus on those first of all and spend more money on that. And then we have to spend more money on research, because, we spend over $1 billion a year researching cancer, and we should. But we spend a fraction of that, a small fraction of that, on researching treatments for drug addiction. And in terms of actually getting help, I mentioned that insurance is required to cover treatment. It is a tragedy that people, when they decide to get help, can't get the insurance coverage they need, in spite of the laws, in spite of the requirement of insurance companies. And that's one of the reasons that right now, the threats on the Affordable Care Act, the threats on parts of the Affordable Care Act include the requirement that companies cover us no matter if we have pre-existing conditions. Well, if you have a problem with drugs in the past, that can be a ground for an insurance company not to cover you. Yeah, if they do cover you, supposedly they have to pay for treatment, but they don't have to. And so, there's a political dimension to this. It's about budget. It's about allocating money for one of the greatest problems that we have. It's about money for treatment. And it's about increasing, not decreasing, the requirement of insurance companies to help. And this is not just private insurance, but also public insurance, Medicare, Medicaid programs in states. Obviously it's something I care about. It's something I care about deeply. I guess the last thing I'll say before we do talk openly about this, and hopefully you'll have questions, and you can add questions to the chat, and I'm looking at the Zoom interface and the Q&A section or the chat section. If you have questions, it is easy to focus on the negative, and we have to focus on the urgency, because otherwise nothing will change. We have to recognize the fact that it's harder for people now because of COVID, and we need to offer more support. But we also have to understand the second part of what I was talking about, that it is a preventable disease and it is treatable. So there is enormous reason to be hopeful, even though we have a long, long, long way to go. But if you have a drug problem, the beginnings of a drug problem, a serious drug problem, if you're worried about someone that we love, there is a course to follow. And if we follow that course, there is a high chance. Again, research shows that the people who do enter the treatment system get better. Not everyone, of course, but that's true of any disease. If somebody has a serious cancer, there's a lot we can do, but we can't help everybody. That's where we are now. We're getting better. We're helping more and more people. And that's a really hopeful and important message, because once we understand that this is a treatable disease and every single day people are going in recovery and they are getting better, then we're more likely to get help ourselves, more likely to help and convince and encourage people that we love to get help. Uh, the more open we'll be about this problem, because we are not shunning people and putting them in a category of people that we've written off. You know, drug addicts can't be helped. Why should we bother even talking about it? Why should we bother offering treatments? They're just going to relapse and they're just going to overdose and become homeless and commit crimes or die. I have a friend who's an emergency room nurse in a hospital near where we live, and she talks to me about the doctors in the emergency room. It just happened the other day. A mom brought her son in. He was overdosing, required immediate medical attention. My friend who's a nurse went up to grab one of the doctors and explain what was going on. And the doctor said, "Oh, he's a junkie. I'll get to him." People die because of that attitude. So the more that we recognize the fact that this is a disease and we can help people, and that doctors are trained, nurses are trained, teachers are trained to recognize people in their classes who have the beginnings of drug problems, because if we do intervene early, we have much more likelihood of being successful in stopping drug use from escalating and people becoming seriously addicted. So there's a lot of reason to be hopeful. A key to this is, Professor Groden talked about it really eloquently at the beginning of this. It's talking about this problem. She talked about the problem of trauma. Trauma is another, you cannot separate talking about trauma and talking about drug use and talking about drug use and talking about trauma, because so many people who are traumatized also find some relief at first in drugs. And of course, drug use makes everything worse. And people not only are traumatized because of traumas that predict drug use, but also traumas related to drug use. The idea of scoring drugs, the idea of shooting up drugs, the idea of committing crimes or being involved in violence related to drugs, all are traumatic. Put these things all together. And how do we begin to get help? It's being open. It's telling our stories. It's why I'm so grateful to be here. Why I'm thankful to you, to the university, for having in place an opportunity to have this conversation. And so now I guess I'll stop talking and hope that I can help in some ways, only if it's only just to start or encourage this conversation from happening. And so please, if anyone has any questions, now's the time, and I'm thrilled to be here. And again, I want to thank you. So Dr. Groden, are there questions there, or Vice Chancellor Hull? I mean, where should we go from here?
So David, if you'd like, I can read some of these questions, or if you want to look at the Q&A. If you want, I'll start reading some of them to you.
Okay.
First one is how is your son doing currently?
Well, thank you for asking. It's, we had many, he just lost, I'm lucky. So many families aren't lucky. I talked about the fact that 200 people a day are dying. Well, that means 200 families a day are suffering the loss of someone that they love because of this problem. But after 10 years, over the course of which I learned a lot about addiction, and I learned, yes, this is a medical disease, and I had to treat it differently than I had in the past. My son, Nick, finally did get in the hands of doctors who diagnosed the fact that not only does he have this very severe addiction, but he also has bipolar disorder and depression. He's been in treatment with those with a psychiatrist. He's been on medications for those diseases. And that was 10 years ago when he started to. And so he's been sober for 10 years. And I'm lucky, he just turned 37. And as I write about in Beautiful Boy, there was a time that I didn't think he'd make it to 21. So we're lucky. And that's part of the reason I am doing, what I do, having conversations like this, is because I realize that we are lucky, and a lot of people haven't been as lucky, and people need to know. But anyway, he's doing great. He's become a television writer. He moved up near where I live recently. In fact, all three of my kids there. So Nick is here, Jasper's here, and Daisy, and everybody goes surfing together and goes on walks and has dinner together. And so we're lucky.
I'll just keep reading some more.
Okay.
What was your son's reaction when you decided to write about his addiction? Was it a struggle to come to the decision to share the story?
Yeah, it was a big, big struggle for me to share the story. And it was because of part of the reason of what I talked about before. It was this sense of judgment and shame to come out in the New York Times and then in a book and then ultimately in a movie to share our family story. It was putting us in a place where our family could be judged and we would be scrutinized, and I was revealing some of our deepest, darkest secrets. And so I was nervous myself about it. And then I also wanted mostly to protect my family, the kids, and my wife and Nick's mom. So we had a lot of conversations about it, and I had to be sure everybody felt okay about it. The reason that it was Nick through the process also realized that part of the way that he needed to be sober and what ultimately helped him was being open about it, not hiding what he was going through, which helped him get treatment and helped him feel less alone. And so he was very committed at that point to sharing our family story for the same reasons. He wanted to encourage a conversation. And so what happened is I wrote about our families first. I wrote about what had happened about the addiction, and it appeared in the New York Times Magazine. And one of the things I mentioned in there that as a high school student, Nick, he was a good writer and he'd gotten some writing award. And so an editor at a publishing house contacted me and asked me if I thought Nick would want to tell his story. I connected them and Nick was thrilled. And so by that period, by the time I decided to write Beautiful Boy, Nick had also determined to write his story in a book. And he ended up writing this book called Tweak. And so he was committed, but I was really scared. I was afraid of opening our family up in ways that, and it was hard. And there were times when it was, especially hard. I know it was hard for everybody else. It was hard for, Jasper and Daisy. It was hard for my wife. It was hard for Nick's mom. But ultimately, I think everybody came to feel the same way, that it was valuable to share our story for the reasons that it showed people that they weren't alone. And it's not just the person who's an addict, and it's not just the person who's the parent, but also, it's specifically hard in different ways to be the brother or sister of somebody who's addicted. Not only are you experiencing this sort of confusion and this chaos about this person in your family who is doing something that just doesn't make any sense, but also I know that there's a lot of times there's anger and there's resentment because of what this person that you love is doing to the family, the chaos and the way that they are sucking, in a sense, draining the energy from the family. Because when I had this kid on the street, I did my best to be, the good dad to Daisy and Jasper as well. I talked about, going to the swim meet still, but it was my focus, which it would be, I think, to any parent, to save his life. I had one kid who was going to die. And so that's what happened, but and it happened for 10 years. So anyway, telling the story was a tough one, but ultimately I look back and I feel like, I'm so glad that we did. And I think hopefully all of us feel that way as well. I have some, if it's easier, a couple of the questions that popped up here. One of them is, a really good question. What was it like working with Timothée Chalamet and Steve Carell? Did you have any say in who got to play the roles? Excuse me. One of the things that came up around the idea of going from the book that I wrote and Nick's book to agreeing to make a movie, right from the beginning, people contacted us and wanted to make movies about the books and our family story. And deciding about the books was hard enough, but in the book, I got to be in control of every single word. The idea of turning our family story over to somebody else, to a filmmaker, was really scary for another reason, that we were going to be trusting them and relying on them to tell our story with some taste and hopefully some art, but also, revealing again. And the other thing is we also were very aware of the fact that movies have a bigger audience. I mean, unfortunately, I guess, or fortunately, however you look at it, more people watch movies in, our culture than read books. And so it was also going to a bigger audience. And, so it took connecting with somebody very, very specific. This guy who's, his name was Jeremy Kleiner. He happens to run Ndidi, Jeremy and Dee I can't believe I'm forgetting her name. But anyway, Jeremy and Dee run Plan B. It's a production company and it's owned by Brad Pitt, and they decided, we met with them. They really convinced us that they wanted to tell the truth. They did not want to make this some silly Hollywood version of what addiction looks like and make it give an easy answer. So we went forward with them, even with some trepidation, and they hired this great director, this guy named Felix van Groningen, who'd made movies only in Belgium, but had a sensibility about what was going on here. Then there was a question, as the question asked, about who was going to play us, which was weird as hell. You imagine that somebody. Anyway, no, we didn't have anything to say ultimately. Although, if they had cast anybody who we really didn't, feel comfortable with, I think they would have listened to us, because they wanted us to understand that. They wanted us to feel good about this. Again, we were trusting them to tell our story, So they went through this whole process. Steve Carell is this beloved actor who everybody knew, mostly because of The Office. And again, it was really weird for me to imagine Michael Scott, the guy I thought of as Michael Scott, even though he'd also made these, some amazing other movies. And it was weird once it happened. People, one person, for whatever reason, I guess, had too much time in their hand and did use Photoshop to put some images online of scenes from The Office in which they put my head on, Steve Carell's head and some of his quotes. So one of them I remember was, they had a place for Michael Scott, so they had me saying, "Guess what? I have flaws. What are they? Oh, I don't know. I sing in the shower. Sometimes I spend too much time volunteering. Occasionally I'll hit somebody with my car. So sue me." I never said that. I kind of wish I had, but so it was weird. But anyway, I met with him. He was very, he'd read the book. He said that it hit him in the gut, not because he'd had experiences with drugs or drugs in his family, but because he did get it, he got what it was like to be a father, terrified of what could happen to your son. His kids were younger. And so he said that it made him really face for the first time that there was a point when our children grow to the point where we have either no influence or less influence on them. And they ultimately are going to make decisions for themselves. And that's terrifying. And so he said that he really connected with this idea of playing a father who was in that position. They also did, again, we weren't involved in it, but they did a casting call, I guess, or I don't know what you call it, for the person who played Nick. And the director, I think he met with a few hundred people before he found this guy who was not well known at that time. He was barely known at all. This actor, Timothée Chalamet, who, when they cast him, and we met with him first, the first meeting, actually, I wasn't there, but Daisy and Nick met with Timmy in a restaurant in LA. And I think they were as stunned as I was that later that, this was a kid who sort of embodied Nick in many ways. He even had a physical resemblance. He kind of moved like Nick. And he was the coolest part that was really impressive is that he took very seriously the idea of entering the world of drug addiction. He did not want to trivialize what it means. And he learned a lot, and he was able to talk to people who were impacted about what addiction is. And it was great. And another reason it was great, because by the time the movie came out, he had become a big star. And he was, the people who were obsessed with him were not people of my generation, but people of his generation. And, he's, I forgot how old he is, in early 20s or something. And there were all these kids, and especially all these girls for some reason, who were just obsessed with him. So the reason that was really cool is that people went to see this movie who never would have seen a movie about drug addiction in a family, who went to see it because this cool, actor who they were all obsessed with was in the movie. And I heard from them afterwards. So many people wrote to me and said, I saw myself and I could have been Nick. So kids who only went to see the movie because they thought it would be fun to see this actor suddenly saw a story that was either related to their family. People wrote and said, my dad is a drug addict and nobody knows. And then I saw the movie and I started talking to people, and I went to a counselor at school. It really had an impact on people in that way. And partly it was because of they chose him, that it had impact on people who were younger, who were sometimes in the throes and sometimes at the beginning stages. And I don't know if that conversation ever would have happened in their families or in their schools. It was also strange in that my Twitter following, went off the charts with people whose names were things like, Timothy Chalamet's hair. Anyway, it turned out, I think mostly because of this idea of connecting with so many people, that the movie, was really ultimately a great thing. Oh, okay, what else?
David, there's a couple that have been added here.
Oh, go ahead.
I
Yeah,
want to
go.
get to.
That's great.
So the first one, as a future nurse, what would be the most important message that you would give to future medical professionals that will no doubt come across those in dire need of medical intervention with regards to addiction?
I think it's one of the best and most important questions that anyone could ask, because once we now are recognizing the facts that addiction is a disease related to mental illnesses that are also diseases, they're disorders of the brain, and they have a social and environmental impacts as well, and sometimes often a genetic component. And we know that, once we know that, and we know that we can help people, then we know where to turn. And we turn to the treatment system, to the medical system, to the system that involves nurses and doctors and psychologists and psychiatrists and treatment professionals. So we turn there, but right now, there's been research that shows us that only 10% of pediatricians, 10% of pediatricians have any training in addiction medicine related to the idea that would help them identify a drug problem in a kid, one of their patients. Well, if we suspect that a child has another problem, has a potential of any kind of problem, we go to the doctor, and the doctor does an exam. A pediatrician does an exam and prescribe medication, or if it's potentially serious, we send us to. So in this situation, we have an opportunity to intervene in somebody as a teenager who's starting to have a drug problem. But because a doctor's never been trained to recognize it, they're sent away and it's never recognized, and it might only come to anybody's, it might only be attended to when somebody becomes much older and it's gotten way, way, way worse, and they've gotten in trouble, or they've gotten, addicted and whatever. So we need to treat professionals. We need to treat our nurses and our doctors. And the cool thing about it, besides helping them learn how to help people, is that it shifts the way that people look. I told you about our nurse, our friend who's a nurse, and the impact that she had in the emergency room, and the difference between her experience and her influence on what happened with this kid who came in and the doctor was huge. The doctor dismissed this person as quote unquote a junkie, didn't want to deal with him. The nurse, on the other hand, recognized that this was a kid who was in trouble and needed help, and the mom who brought him there was devastated, and she came at it with a completely opposite view, which was of compassion, which is the way that we would look at somebody who is sick. So I think that, as a potential in this field, nurses are on the front lines. And in some ways, I would say at least it's equally important for nurses to be trained. And I can't separate it. It's everybody who's a professional needs to be trained in this. But nurses are often on the front lines and have the ability to change a person's experience. So even in that situation, in that emergency room, a doctor might be dismissive, but if there is a compassionate person who is there to be there to offer that kind of support and to try to get them help. I mean, my friend didn't just leave it that, she actually is a pretty, you can't say no to my friend. So, she got the doctor, she gave him a piece of her mind, and eventually, he saw this kid, they administered Narcan, they saved his life, and did what the other thing that medical professionals need to know is that saving someone's life isn't enough. They need treatment because this is a serious illness, and they need to go into therapy, or they need to go into some treatment program. And if it's acute, they might need to go into a residential program. If it's not, they might need to go into an outpatient program. The minimum is that they need to go in therapy. So that involves education, and to know how to recognize a drug problem and then how to intervene. But thank you for doing this, and thanks for asking the question, because boy, do we need you. We need people who are in this field, who is compassionate and who understands what it means, what addiction is. Did you, was there another one, or should I?
Cheryl, do you want to ask one more?
Sure. There's so many questions. I'm trying to figure out which one to give you. If a person was ready to finally get help regarding addiction, but very hesitant and nervous, what type of treatment would you recommend first? And how would you go about trying to help someone who does not want help? Like a two-parter there.
Well, two parts. Well, the first part is that if you need treatment and you know you need treatment, but it's scary, then boy, you're not alone. I mean, it is scary. It's terrifying. And it's additionally terrifying because of the stigma around this. Again, if you had, if you worried that you had, a friend of ours had some symptoms that suggested maybe she had an early stage of breast cancer, scary, but it doesn't have the emotional stigma of going in to check. But if you have a problem with drug use or mental illness, there still is a stigma. And so that it adds that level of fear. And also because people don't know what I said before, which is that it is treatable if people go into treatment, there also adds that level of fear. It's like no matter what you do, it's not going to help. And there is the physiological component of being addicted, which is that the brain of somebody who's addicted, I said earlier that it looks differently on a scan because it is functioning differently. The difference is, one of the sort of material differences is that people who are addicted their brains have shifted so that the normal for them is the presence of a drug. An addict has described it as it feels to them as like it would feel to somebody else who doesn't understand, like we need oxygen to survive. If your brain has changed, then it feels like you need that drug in order to survive because your brain will go into shock. And that's what detox is, and detox can be very dangerous depending on the drug, which is why we need help to do that piece of it. And it's why it can feel to somebody like they're going to die, and they could. So yeah, it's scary. So you gotta know that there is help, and there is. And I know it from our family story, and I know it from the story of thousands of other people. So as scary as it is, get help. And how do you start? I talked about the difficulty of access. The first step is to talk to somebody who's a professional. If you're, in the university, if you're part of that community, go to health services, make those calls. I guess in the old days you could actually walk in. Maybe you still can. Dr. Gordon, you can say if this is still an option, but at least I know that there are options to call. If you don't have that option, go online to either, if anybody wants to email me because you want this on, you want to remember it, you can't remember it now, is the American Association of Addiction Psychiatrists, AAAP.org, or ASAM, ASAM.org, which is the American Society of Addiction Medicine. They have directories of therapists, psychologists, and psychiatrists all over the country who are trained in addiction medicine. It doesn't mean you're committing to go into a 3-month rehab program. It doesn't even suggest that you have that problem. If you make that call and talk to somebody, they will help you decide what the first step is. Is your problem serious enough that you need attention? If it isn't, let's monitor it. If it is, what do you do first? And it's scary, but that's the way we would start if we had any illness. The other question about how do you get somebody into treatment who needs help, really hard. If you have somebody who has another illness, it's not going to be probably that hard to get someone to go to the doctor. But with addiction, because of those brain changes and also the same changes that happen around the person who's using drugs, oftentimes their community has changed. They're scared. Their lives they've come to rely on drugs to function. The idea of stopping is terrifying, and sometimes they don't even see that they have a problem. Oftentimes they don't. If you talk to somebody who clearly from the outside, needs addiction treatment, they'll often tell you, I'm not an addict, I'm using for fun, I have a right to do whatever I want, I'll stop whenever I want, I can stop on my own. So it can be really frustrating. And so what do you do? It's the same advice that I would give somebody who has addiction. Don't try to figure it out yourself. Do it. Get help. Go talk to a counselor. I've got a friend. I've got a husband, a wife, a partner. I've got a child. I've got a parent who has a problem. What do I do? Because there are methods to go through, and there is another place I can say, another online resource here that can make a huge difference, and that's called, the website I don't have, but if you look up CRAFT, C-R-A-F-T, and addiction, it will take you to the centers that specialize in this intervention that is exactly designed to help us get a loved one treatment. And it also to support us if we need help with that, because if we're in that situation, it is incredibly stressful. But there are scientifically proven, evidence-based interventions that can help us get somebody that we love in treatment, even if they deny at first that they have a problem. And it's done not in the way of like the old addiction intervention TV shows where you kidnap somebody in the middle of the night and you send them. It's different. It's about a community reinforcement of love, of family or friends that get together to help a person understand that it doesn't even matter if they can acknowledge that they have addiction or not. It matters that there is a problem, and that we're all in this together. It is not you versus us. It's that we're all together. We care. We are sympathetic. What can we do? And we'll help. Is there another question? Vice Chancellor Hall, do you have another one, or should I?
I have one more. Sorry, I was trying to use my space bar to turn my mic back on, and it didn't want to do that. So let's make this the last one, and then we'll wrap up for the day. And actually, it's one I'm going to ask. It was something you and I and Dr. Groden talked briefly about before we got on today. Is the growth of telemedicine in the wake of COVID something that you see value in the care of those with substance use and disorders?
Well, huge. It is for, first of all, just the accessibility of any treatment at all, or any access to healthcare. Telemedicine is a help for many people that do not have easy access to healthcare. I was at the Navajo Indian Reservation in northern Arizona, and the nearest clinic for any kind of a medical problem, never mind a mental health related problem, was a 3-hour drive away. And so it was really prohibitive for people to go. And if people didn't go unless it was a crisis, and the idea of telemedicine can bring medicine to communities, to people that otherwise might not have easy access or any access. It also has helped enormously, of course, during this pandemic at a time when people can't, or it's really hard. I mean, there are options still for people who need to go to inpatient treatment, but the ability to consult doctors and specialists, the kinds of people I'm talking about via, virtually, is huge. These treatments can be expensive ultimately. I mean, therapy, if it's covered by insurance or if it's free because it's it's great. But for people who don't have access to that, telemedicine often there are cheap options or even free options. And what they've learned is that it works. And that's a huge, huge thing to know, because at first that people didn't know if it worked. It doesn't work for everybody, but therapy sessions, there's a research that it's not just about addiction related therapy, but there's been some research that shows that in some cases, for some people, telemedicine is a more useful and profound experience than, and also people actually follow through more. You don't have to drive an hour to the doctor's office and sit in the therapy for an hour and drive back. That's 3 hours. Instead, you turn on your computer and it's an hour. So accessibility wise in that way. But also there is an intimacy that it doesn't replace in-person medicine, but it has some, it has some benefits even. And so there are trade-offs. But at the same time, I was going to say that when you talk about something that is as complicated as addiction and mental illnesses that are related to addiction, a lot of the interventions require a peer environment. So that, yes, there are groups online where people can connect either through an official channel, or if you go online and if you look up support groups for people with addiction, support groups for AA, 12-step programs, Al-Anon for families. There are meetings probably 24 hours a day, depending on what time you're free and you want it online. But some people that is a breakthrough. Again, a place to share stories, their own story, and listen to other people's stories. So I completely advise people to go there and just to take advantage of that. And it does work. It's an enormous benefit. Some people need more than that. Some people do need that in-person connection. And that applies to people who are suffering from mental health disorders and family members who are, and there it becomes, a practical matter. If there aren't practitioners who can do that now because of COVID, and the next best thing is doing it virtually, then do it virtually. Eventually that'll shift. And for people who do need that, being in the same room to be able to give a hug, what's that anymore? We kind of forgot what that's like. Right now it's all virtual hugs, or a lot mostly, but eventually it will be the other. So the other piece, I'm giving you a long-winded answer to this, but the other part of it is because some of the interventions to addiction are based on science, that there is an ability to do a lot of behavioral treatments as efficiently virtually. And the other thing that we know, which is relatively new, it's not new, but it's newly accepted now, is that a big component of addiction treatment for many, many, many people is psychiatric medications. For somebody who's addicted to an opioid, medications, buprenorphine, Suboxone, can increase the likelihood that they will be able to get sober and stay sober by 2/3. And that can happen virtually. Meet with a psychiatrist, talk about your symptoms. If a psychiatrist determines that Suboxone is going to help you, they contact the pharmacy, you get the medication, you check up with them, you meet with them over and over again. That's a huge piece that can be done just as easily over virtually. So if that's the last question, I want to thank you so much for the invitation to do this. I'm always open virtually to more questions. David Sheff at Gmail. I hope you continue the conversation in your community, offering support to one another. So maybe one of the things that can be done, if there's I imagine there's a list of people who've been here to this involved group today, that maybe there's a way either on the website or by email or whatever on the school's website to list options. If you're struggling, if you're depressed because of COVID and your isolation, or somebody you would love has COVID or some other problem or anything that's going on in your life, we have services. Call these numbers. Or if you need references for these support groups, we have them, and it would be great. I'm sure they're there, but it would be great to maybe direct people who are in need to what's out there. So I guess that's also, Professor Groden, did you have, were you going to comment on that? I imagine the school has this up there already.
I am going to make sure that all this information is up there, because I honestly don't know. But I did just make myself a big note to make sure that it is there. But no, I just want to thank you so much. It was a really fabulous talk. So many questions. I want to find a way to make sure I can hold on to all these questions, because I know many people are reaching out for personal reasons, family members, and want to know how to best help people. So,
but it might be if you feel like it would be useful, rather than have people write individually, if they've already written in questions, if you want to email me those questions, I can respond and send them back to you, and you can, pass them along. It might take me a little bit of time to get to them, but I will, because I really, I know that people are suffering and people are struggling and they need help. So thank you, everybody. And thanks, thanks everybody who, whether you have your pajamas still on or what, thanks for being here.
Well, thank you, David. Thank you, Dr. Groden. Thank you, everyone who participated today. And it was a wonderful presentation. I know there's many, many thank yous coming through the chat and through the Q&A right now. So for everyone out there, we look forward to seeing you again in the spring for our next presentation. And you'll see more about that in the coming weeks and months. So everyone have a wonderful day and be safe.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you again.